vagus nerve hack everyone's missing, and the surprising connection between feet, digestion, and reproductive health. Last week I shared some of the lessons I learned in Aspen about the links between foot function, breathing patterns, and craniofacial development. Today I want to join some more dots for you. You see, it's not just breathing and airway that are impacted by how well or how badly our feet work. There are multiple other organs and systems that rely on proper feedback from our feet in order to function correctly. Many of these connections aren't obvious, and they're certainly not something that I was ever taught in school. But once you understand the mechanisms, they make complete sense. Really getting this and applying it clinically will place you in the top 5% of docs in the world. Many claim to treat the body holistically, yet they're totally overlooking this critical piece. So let's get into it. We've talked previously about the postural adaptations that occur when someone habitually wears shoes and walks on flat, neurologically boring surfaces. If you missed it, I'll place a link to episode 7 in the comments below. As our arches dysfunction, our center of gravity shifts back towards our heels, forcing us to compensate by swaying our pelvis forward. This lower body shift then requires an upper body compensation of slumping our head and shoulders forward in order to stay kind of more or less upright. This is the purely mechanical explanation of what we observe in practice. But like so many things in the body, there are multiple layers of causation at play here. The layer we're exploring today is the foot-viscera connection. It all starts with the deep front line. We discussed this last week as the primary mechanism linking foot function to breathing and airway function. It's also the primary link between foot function and core stability. The deep front line begins under the feet, with the insertions of the tibialis posterior muscles on the plantar surface of the foot. So it runs down here and wraps around and inserts all over the plantar surface, but particularly in the midfoot here. And then on the other side, we've got peroneus longus, which runs down and connects very closely to the same place. So this fascial connection between these two insertions forms the base of the lateral line, which then runs up the outside of the leg and provides lateral stability to the pelvis, which is critical for our ability to stand on one leg and to actually walk, to perform bipedal gait. So this connection between the deep front line and the lateral line forms kind of a sling underneath the midfoot, which lifts and supports our arches. So from there, the deep front line runs up along tib posterior through the adductors, and it blends with the muscles of the pelvic floor, the psoas, and the diaphragm. So this makes it essential for core activation. It's simply impossible to have a strong core without a functional deep front line. But here's where it gets interesting though. Research has shown that when we activate the intrinsic muscles of our feet, it reflexively activates the muscles of the pelvic floor. I'll include a link to the research paper in the comments. This synergistic action and activation goes only one way. So activating foot muscles reflexively activates pelvic floor muscles, but activating pelvic floor muscles didn't activate the foot muscles. So when you think about it, this makes sense. What's the point of having a strong, stable core if it's not firmly anchored to the ground? I see many programs, therapists, personal trainers out there all working to help people activate their core. But it's like they seem to believe that the core just kind of floats along above the ground. There's no attention paid to building strong, functional feet and enhancing that foot-core connection. The implications of this are obvious. The effects of a weak core are well studied and understood. Lower back and pelvic instability, vulnerability to injury, poor posture, muscle activation patterns, recurring subluxations. This is one of the reasons why wearing better balance orthotics is so helpful to patients with lower back issues. I also believe it explains why I ended up with an abdominal hernia in my 30s. Years of walking on flat, totally inhibited feet inhibited my deep front line and lateral line and sabotaged my core, despite the fact that I was training hard as a rock climbing instructor 5 to 7 days a week at the time. But today we're going to go beyond simple mechanical explanations. Today we're digging into how this affects visceral and autonomic function, particularly our parasympathetic system, so our rest and digest system. Years ago, I studied visceral biomechanics with Dr. Victor Portelli, an Australian AK diplomat. Victor drew on his deep knowledge and decades of experience with chiropractic, applied kinesiology, anatomy, dissection, and hunting to develop a comprehensive understanding of how organs move and how this impacts their function. His work really revolutionized my practice. I highly recommend it. I think he's teaching in Naples this month in Italy. One thing that Victor found commonly in his clinic was abdominal organs dropping inferiorly, known as visceral ptosis. Organs frequently affected include the kidneys, the large intestine, the small intestine, the stomach, the bladder, uterus, ovaries, prostate, basically everything abdominal and pelvic. At the time I took his courses, I assumed this was largely due to gravity, which of course it is. But now I realize that pelvic floor dysfunction is a huge contributor. How can you expect something to hold up when you drop the floor out from under it? Not only that, you also introduce slack into the walls or the abdominal muscles, and even the roof, the diaphragm. If you remember our tensegrity model from episode 4, again, I'll link it in the comments below in case you missed it. So, Victor taught us that our organs are meant to slide and glide over and around each other, massaging and stimulating proper function. And all of this is orchestrated by the complex web of fascia that they're embedded in, and is primarily driven by the motion of our diaphragm as we breathe, which takes us back to last week's episode and the importance of correct breathing. The DFL is the master organizing principle that choreographs this intricate dance. When it isn't functioning effectively, organs drop, their movement becomes restricted, lymphatic drainage is inhibited, blood flow gets disrupted, and they become stagnant and dysfunctional. So, who do you think this might apply to in your clinic? When I was studying chiropractic at university, I was taught to consider pelvic dysfunction or pelvic floor dysfunction in postpartum women and maybe cases of dysmenorrhea or chronic lower back pain. And that was it. And for years, that's all I did. However, over time, as I learned more effective techniques for treating pelvic floor issues, like the origin insertion technique we discussed in episode 5, I started looking for and testing for it more frequently. And I started finding that it was much, much more common than I'd been trained to consider. In fact, these days, it's something that I check on every patient. If you want a short list of the most obvious suspects where to start in your own clinic, think about anyone with lower back pain, anyone with incontinence, even if it's just a little. This is one that's way more common than most people think. Anyone who's been pregnant, regardless of what type of delivery they had. Any woman with hormonal or cycle-related symptoms. Any man with prostate problems. Any male or female sexual dysfunction. Anyone with nighttime urinary frequency. Anyone with any type of hernia, digestion issues, recurring UTIs, poor posture, and even anyone who just gets tired after being on their feet for a while. That's kind of pretty long list, right? That's almost everybody. Over time, I started seeing that these pelvic floor issues are almost universal, at least within the chiropractic patient population in my clinic, which puzzled me, right? How could that be possible? It didn't really make sense until I took on Better Balance orthotics and I dived down the rabbit hole of understanding foot function and its links to almost everything else in the body, especially, in this case, the pelvic floor. What I came to recognize is that there's one universal stress that almost every single one of us shares. And that is, you've heard me say it before, right? It's wearing modern shoes and walking on flat, unnatural surfaces. Once I understood what that was doing to our feet and how it was sabotaging our pelvic floor through the deep front line connection, it suddenly clicked. No wonder pelvic floor problems are so rampant. And when the pelvic floor goes, the abdominal organs go with it. This doesn't just cause the mechanical, lymphatic, and blood flow problems I described above, or I described earlier. It's also a major issue for the nervous system. More or less all of the abdominal organs are innervated by the vagus nerve. It's the basis of our parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system. It's the driver of really all our digestion and all our kind of relaxation functions. The vagus nerve originates in the brainstem, travels down through the neck to the thoracic and abdominal organs. When you drop the pelvic floor and the abdominal organs drop with it, you create a stretching force on the vagus and its branches. For years in chiropractic, we've talked about the negative effects of compression on nerves, but modern research reveals that stretch injuries can be just as bad, if not even worse. Again, I'll drop a research link in the comment below. In the paper, the authors state, stretch injuries are among the most devastating forms of peripheral nerve injury. Another paper found that stretching the sciatic nerve, just 15 to 16% of its length, completely stopped intraneural blood flow, leading to ischemia, conduction block, and axonal injury, similar to compression. For this reason, the brain will not tolerate excessive stretch to the vagus nerve. So when the pelvic floor dysfunctions and the abdominal organs drop, the body is forced to compensate. And it does this by dropping the head forward to reduce the distance between the brainstem and the abdominal organs. So one of the exact compensation patterns that we see consistently resulting from poor foot mechanics. I believe this is one of the reasons why we see such big improvements in forward head posture when people start wearing better balance orthotics. It's not just that their center of gravity shifts as their feet function better. It's also that their pelvic floor activation increases, leading to less visceral ptosis and therefore less stretch on the vagus nerve. These days I notice online all sorts of various vagus nerve stimulators are all the rage. They're being sold to help all sorts of symptoms and conditions. Now, whilst they might be helpful for some, like so many applications within the medical system and the marketing industry, this is just a short-sighted, symptom-focused approach of blindly stimulating the nerve without considering what's actually causing it to dysfunction in the first place. I kind of wonder what would happen if all those people replaced their expensive vagal nerve stimulators with a simple pair of better balance orthotics and took a daily walk. I shared last week the amazing synergy of how all the different presentations in Aspen at the Ski for Wally seminar linked together, despite none of us having any foreknowledge of what the others were presenting. And there's two more that are worth briefly mentioning. One was a presentation by Dr. Phil Cameron on the impressive results he was getting applying injury recall technique to organs, especially those containing smooth muscle, like the small intestine and the bladder. So normally in AK we think of injury recall technique as applying to muscles, but here it was being applied to organs. I found it also applies to vessels such as the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava. Phil described how persistent musculoskeletal problems were clearing up once he addressed these injury patterns to the organs. So persistent problems that weren't improving with just regular chiropractic, that basically just disappeared when you cleared out the injury patterns in the abdominal organs. So how would that happen, right? How would an abdominal organ become injured? I think the mechanism that I've described earlier is a huge and common contributor. Another presentation by Dr. Tom O'Brien described how basically all diseases are really diseases of inflammation, and basically all inflammation traces its root cause back to leaky gut. The causes were many and varied. He shared an incredible amount of detail during his 4-hour presentation, but I'll speculatively add one more to the list here. We understand in chiropractic that structure governs function. When you inhibit the pelvic floor, drop the abdominal organs, and interfere with their natural movement, blood flow, lymphatic drainage, and innervation, isn't it likely that you hamper their healthy function, weakening digestion and thereby contributing to systemic inflammation? I think it is. The bottom line is this: when you prescribe better balance orthotics and you apply the techniques that I've shared in my presentations and in these videos, you're doing far more than just helping your patients stand, walk, and move better. In fact, you're impacting multiple aspects of physiology through multiple mechanisms and taking advantage of one of the most profound windows for clinical intervention that most practitioners are just completely missing. So next time you see a patient experiencing any of the challenges I described today, give them the gift of prescribing better balance orthotics. They'll thank you for it. And if you know any other docs who'd love to up their clinical game, please share this video with them. Their patients will thank you too. All right, have a great week.